Thank you for the warm welcome and introduction. Welcome, everyone. I am pleased that everyone was able to join us this afternoon on in New Haven, at least, a glorious afternoon. Actually, probably the first day of spring, or feels like the first real day of spring. I'd like to first of all thank the generosity of William Pickens III, the grandson of William Pickens, who donated a portion of his grandfather's papers in 2001, and then later in 2014, the books are from his library, and which I'll talk about and describe later in this presentation. Today, I'm hope to give you a brief introduction to William Pickens and also to his library. And I'll cover who is William Pickens, why is he important, his time at Yale, very brief, and his library, what's in it, some of the genres and themes, inscriptions, annotations, and then what are some of the possible research questions that might be answered, or at least partially answered, or start when looking and doing research within his library. William Pickens was a civil rights leader, educator, orator, author, editor, and more. He was an active leader of the NAACP between the 1920s and 1940, and he had the challenge of navigating through his times, moving between issues ranging from the early civil rights movement, the Garvey movement, civil rights, as I mentioned, the communist challenge, the New Deal, the Black response to the First World War, as well as the Second World War, and how to work with the white race. Although not as well known today as many of his peers, such as James Weldon Johnson, Walter White, Carter Goodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, in his time, he was a prominent leader of the Black community. And his reputation as an orator was second to none. And in fact, he was thought to be the most prominent orator between Booker T. Washington and Martin Luther King. His papers and his books reflect the tensions, the excitement, the energy, the brilliance that was happening during this period. And I hope over the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes to share a little bit more about Mr. Pickens, his collection of his library, and his papers, and hopefully that you will take the opportunity to learn more about Mr. Pickens as a result of this. So just who is he, and let's have a little background. So a little bit chronology just to help the context. William Pickens was born in 1881 in South Carolina. He later moved with his family to Arkansas. He graduated in 1902 from Talladega College in Alabama with a BA degree. He later went on to Yale University 2 years later, graduating with a BA degree from Yale. And then between 1904 and 1919, he was a professor and educator at multiple institutions, including Talladega College, Wiley College in Texas, and Morgan College, which is today Morgan State University in Baltimore. And along the way, while he was in those positions, he earned an MA from Fisk and a doctorate in literature from Selma University in Alabama, and an LLD from Wiley College. In 1919, he made a change in terms of, he had been involved actively in the teens, in the civil rights movement, speaking actively involved in the NAACP, helping to recruit members in serving in the field. And he was then in 1919 hired or appointed to be assistant to James Weldon Johnson, who at that time was field secretary of the NAACP. When Johnson was promoted to executive secretary in 1920, Pickens became field secretary and director of branches. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a couple of minutes. In 1940, and he served in those roles until 1942, although in the last year or so, I think he was more of a interim or sort of on a leave of absence. In 1941, with the start of the Second World War, he became director-in-chief of the interracial section of the Savings Bond Division for the U.S. Treasury Department and served in that role until 1950. He unfortunately died aboard a ship. He was a great traveler, but he died aboard a ship off of Jamaica in 1954. So mentioned that he came to Yale. So William Pickens came to Yale as a junior in 1903, graduated in 1902 to 3, so 3 to 4, graduated in 1904. At that point, he was one of less than a dozen Black students at Yale. And this is where the student body population of several hundred, a couple thousand, and Yale at that point was not highly integrated, which is not a surprise. In the library itself, though, there are several books that Pickens used as a student at Yale, including 2 different editions of Robert Browning's poetry. And this is the first example, the earliest example of an annotation from Mr. Pickens, dated December 12th, 1902. And he didn't have any annotations in this one, other than in the bottom here, you see at page 228, but I believe that's just the number of pages that were in the book. It was still interesting to see that he held on to these books throughout his life. One of the highlights of his career at Yale was winning as an orator, the 10 Ike Oratory Prize. And he won this as a competition within the junior class, and it received prominence across the country. There are 2 scrapbooks in the papers that have tons of articles around highlighting Mr. Pickens and his successful winning of the prize. And in a second scrapbook goes on to talk about a number of the lectures that he gave over the next 2 to 3 years. And these scrapbooks are actually a really interesting entry into William Pickens, his life, his writings, the response to his writings and his speaking. And it's really interesting to see where the newspapers that were publishing about him, many of them were from New Haven, at least the ones in one of these scrapbooks, but there were other newspapers from around the country as well. So he was also, he graduated in 1904. He was also a Phi Beta Kappa, member of Phi Beta Kappa as well. And it was unusual. And one of the things, if you read, and we'll talk a little bit about his autobiography, this was one of the highlights of his early life, certainly. And the idea that going to Yale was a sort of a major stepping stone. And he saw it as a stepping stone into the broader world. So not just as a college student, but also just being connected with people who were trying to make a difference around the country. So after serving at various education positions, as I mentioned, he moved on to the NAACP. So this is a photograph that's actually in the Mary White Ovington Papers, our collection at Wayne State. Pickens is on the far left. James Weldon Johnson is in the middle. Walter White is the second from the right. And this was the early team. What was interesting is that this is the senior leadership and part of the senior leadership of the NAACP. And by 1921, most of the officers or the senior leadership were Black Americans. Interestingly enough, at that point, though, the board was still made up of mostly whites, which took much more time to gradually change. And it reflects the role and what was happening in race relations at that point. Today, it's hard to imagine a situation like that, but in that period, perhaps less so. So the library. So this is a shot. There are approximately 150 books in the library. These are, we've individually boxed them just to protect them in terms of storage. There are also several boxes of archival material. There are also several in the archives. There are also a couple of boxes of what we would call reference material. And then also a small collection of pamphlets of what Pickens wrote. It's interesting to think about what's in these books. So these range from the earliest books he acquired that we know of is the 1898 from his time at Yale, although I have to look through all of the inscriptions. I thought I saw at least a couple from his time at Talladega. I'm not entirely clear if those were when he was a faculty member or if he was a student. Of the circa 150 books, approximately 18 are before 1900, were published before 1900. Approximately 14 books were published between 1900 and 1920 when he joined the NAACP leadership. 84 books, so almost over half, were between 1920, or published between 1920 and 1941, and about 28 books were published after 1941. So in the books are also works by Pickens himself. And I would, if you have the opportunity, go out and buy a copy of his autobiography, Bursting Bonds, the autobiography of a New Negro. The first autobiography he did was entitled The Heir of Slaves. It was published in 1911 in Boston. And then Bursting Bonds was published in 1923. It's basically an expanded version of Heir of Slaves, which took him up through his time at Yale. And then Bursting Bonds talks, or just a little bit after his time at Yale. And then Bursting Bonds was the following 12 years. And it really is an interesting story and perception. And you can see him changing as a writer and as a leader, and how he perceived and how he talked about his experience and how he talked about others. It's a great read. I got my copy. You can find it on ABE Books, biblio.com. I think I got mine from Powell's bookstore for $4. But it's a great read. It also, small tangential, it introduced, if you haven't read autobiographies of African Americans, it's a great potential collecting area and also reading theme. It's interesting to watch how they change over time. So in the collection are works by Pickens, as not only his autobiographies, but examples of his pamphlets that he was producing and publishing. These were from the teens, and so these were slightly before his time when he officially joined the NAACP. But it gives examples of the types of writing that Pickens was doing, both in terms as an author, but also the oratory. So he was a great public speaker and was asked to speak on many occasions to organizations. And some of these pamphlets are also were based upon speeches that he gave. So what's in the library? So I gave you a chronological breakdown, but I also want to talk a little bit about what when I look through the 150, is looking around at the themes. And these are my perception. Another person, and this is really one of the important things, might look and see different themes and different ideas of how to think about these books. So one theme is on the left-hand side, are examples of works from the Harlem Renaissance. So the classic, many of them classic literary works. Many of these we own already. We had copies at Beinecke just because of the nature of the collections. But these were interesting because they were Pickens' own copies. Many of them were inscribed, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it shows the range of material. And I will show later, he was also a reader. These are not collector's copies. So often in a rare book library, you want a pristine, a perfect copy, as close to the original as possible in terms of when it was published. These are reader's copies. These are copies of books that someone engaged with at least once, if not on a regular basis. On the right-hand side are examples of books around race, around the concept and the ideas around race. And it shows the types of books that were being published, some self-published, some major publishers that William Pickens acquired to help him study and think about his concept of race, and watching those ideas change over time. Another set of themes were, on the left-hand side, were folks involved with the NAACP at the senior leadership level. So these include examples of James Weldon Johnson's works written while he was a member of the NAACP and after he left in 1930, as well as Walter White's novel Flight, and then Mary White Ovington's memoir of A Portrait in Color. And so many of these are inscribed to William Pickens, and you can read in the inscriptions what people thought of each other. Some of them are very polite, some of them, and not so much these, but in other examples where he was a famous person and someone was just sending them a copy of their book. But it's still interesting to think about networks. On the right-hand side are examples of works, many of them by African-American writers or authors. They're historians, literary, memoirs, many of the names that who are well known in that time. It's interesting when you read spines as a librarian. I'm interested in who were the publishers, who were the authors, were they self-published, were they small press publications, who was doing the publishing, and then also how did Pickens engaged with these books along the way. So once he had the books, how did that play out? So as I noted earlier, Inscriptions. So this is a copy of James Weldon Johnson's The Book of American Negro Spirituals, published in 1925, with a very lovely, to my friend William Pickens, sincerely James Weldon Johnson. And as you will see in a minute, Johnson's handwriting is slightly better than William Pickens' handwriting. William Pickens' handwriting makes, I feel much better when I see it. My handwriting is not great. His is probably comparable. But inscriptions are really important because they really start showing the networking that happens. Who knew who? How do they interact with one another? Did they share books? When did they get them? And the number of titles that are inscribed to Pickens demonstrates his role in the civil rights movement and as a Black American in the 1920s, especially in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. As I've noted, many of the books, probably about 2/3 of the books are annotated, or written in, or inscribed. Many of them are inscribed with the date of when he bought it. You can track where he was living. By 1932, he was in Brooklyn. Before, in the 20s, he was living in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. He also had, and I would love to know why, but he also had the habit of, you often autograph your book, or you sign your name in it, so we get a copy back. But he also often signed on page 100, 200, and if there are 300 pages, he would sign his name on page 300. And so what's interesting, and I'll talk about this in the sort of research questions, is, well, when did he acquire these books? I gave the dates of publication, but there is also an exercise in terms of seeing, well, when was he acquiring these books? What were the dates? How close were they to when they were published? When were they books that he acquired later in life? Who was he getting them from? And being able to analyze this, I think there's a lot of potential there to learn about him as a writer, as a scholar, as a leader. So he inscribed books, but he also he was a reader. As I mentioned earlier, he was not a collector per se, although he has great books in his collection, but he saw these books as things to learn, books to learn from, things to respond to, books in which to think about his other works. And so these are 3 of the more heavily annotated books, and interesting mix and match. So H.L. Mencken's Prejudices from 1920, and you can see his response, William Pickens' response in the margins. And I'll talk about this again in the end, but one of the questions is like, well, how did this inform his writing and his speaking? And did he read, did he allude to Mencken's work? Did they show up in force? That's really one of the really interesting research questions that is out there. And the upper right-hand corner was the Henry Fry's work on the modern Ku Klux Klan. And in this case, Pickens was writing in the end sheets along the way. And he would have had notes throughout the text as well. And then in the lower right-hand corner is Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom from 1855, acquired, I think, around 1930, in the 30s as well. And in here, he does a lot of sometimes underlining or highlighting certain texts. And when flipping through it, I couldn't see a pattern. I'd have to go spend a much more time looking at what he was highlighting. Sometimes he just refers to a page number, and sometimes he actually has notes, as in the handwriting here. And then I think I said about, and I'll just say it again to repeat, about 2/3 of the books are marked up in some way. About 1/3 we know came from his library, but there's no physical evidence that he owned them. But you can tell that they're read, they're just not written in. So this is the copy also from My Bondage and My Freedom. And so in this case, 1930, so he acquired this book in 1939. And he was from a friend for his birthday. And what's interesting is he's made, I did this when growing up, you put a paper bag book jacket to protect the book. And on the cover, he's noted page numbers. And I still haven't figured out how the page numbers line up. At first, I thought they were marking where he annotated the book, but that's not always the case. Another explanation I had as well is just tracking where he had left off in terms of, instead of using a bookmark, was he writing the page numbers as he went along so he knew where to pick up. Something for someone to do more investigation. There are several examples in the library of this type of annotation as well. So research questions. So I want to talk a little bit around what are some of the questions a library like this can tell you. So I want to step back a little bit. It's really great to have a large number of books annotated by a known author and someone who we can see the impact those annotations or those books had on their writing and their speaking. Today, we often go out of our way to acquire annotated books for the library. So we regularly are buying annotated books from the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century. In fact, it's a major collecting area. We are always interested when we have an author's library. We want anything that they've annotated because it shows how they're engaged with the book or with a book. And it's really, this collection really gives us an opportunity to explore more about William Pickens as a writer, as a reader, as a thinker. So what are some of the questions that a library like this can, you might try to answer? And this is it's a way to, it's a starting point. Someone would have to do work elsewhere to complement, to build off of this. But examples are, so what was the network of William Pickens, what was William Pickens' network of contacts? Whose books did he acquire and keep? This could be done through inscriptions. These could also be the actual titles. It'll be interesting then to see when did he acquire them? Were they acquired soon after they were published or were they decades later? Second of all, how many of these inscriptions mesh to William Pickens' correspondence and folks who he's regularly working with or in contact with? Or were there, sometimes you just get books that just someone wanted to send to the famous person that Pickens was. It's also interesting to think about how this reflected along this network of the major leaders of the Black community. And how those books moved back and forth. So if there were other examples of so we have many books from James Weldon Johnson's library here. Are there similar books in both libraries? And so how do you compare and contrast what's in Johnson's library for what's in Pickens' library or for our other major African-American figures? And thinking about this as readers, not necessarily as collectors. A second question is, how did these works inform William Pickens' writings and as well as his speaking? I don't know if I noted earlier, but he was a major contributor to African-American or Black newspapers and periodicals. He was a member of the Associated Negro Press. So basically imagine the AP Press. And he had a weekly column that appeared in newspapers across the country for about 20 years. And so how did these books inform that writing or his thoughts in there? And that would be, how to match those up would be very interesting. What were the works in the fields that were owned, that were important in his time, but today are less important? One of the things when looking through the library is that there are works that I had never, or writers who I'd never heard of, but were clearly important in that time, whose notoriety or fame has declined over time. And what does that mean? How did William Pickens annotate? Excuse me. Sorry. So how did he annotate his book? Does those annotations change over time? What was the style? What was he annotating? What was he noting? What was he highlighting? And how did that change, or did they change? That's really interesting. Another question is, where and when did William Pickens acquire his works? Were they gifts? Was he buying them? Why were these books kept as opposed to others that he may not have kept? And as I noted earlier, how did these books influence his writing and speaking? I would also take the step back and think about how did this, I think I've talked about this earlier, but how does this compare to other libraries that people were putting together? There was lots of efforts around building, like what were choice collections of books that you should have if you were building your own personal library? How did this align or not align? I think what fascinated me was just the range of people and range of books that he was collecting. I will say it included literary, it included historical, it included memoir, very few sports, which is interesting. I don't know enough about him, may not have any interest in sports, but he did have several books from W.C. Handy in terms of music. The other question, and this is one I would pose to the family, is like, did he have other books? Why were these the ones that survived? Were these his favorite? These were the ones that were most prominent within the family. Were other books gotten rid of? We all, over time, have books that come and go out of our libraries. So I just want to, so if you are interested in learning more about the library, just a few things. I can't help it, I'm being a librarian here. One is, how do you find these? So you could do a search in Orbis, which is Yale's online catalog, for Pickens, William, and you do a search called Special Collections. And so we have in each catalog record, we note if it was owned by him, if it's annotated, if there's an autograph, if there's a presentation inscription, and you would turn these up. I also want to talk to Mike about, I have a spreadsheet that I put together of all the books, the titles and the notes, and I'm happy to share that out to people. And also we'll see if we can post it on our website. Second, this is actually more for the archive. So we have something called Archives at Yale. If you just do a search, it shows up. And this is where you discover our archival material at Yale. And so there are three major areas where there are papers relating to William Pickens. One, his own papers, which is where we pulled the scrapbooks from, and the Yale diploma. There is also 2 folders of correspondence between James Weldon Johnson and William Pickens, nearly all of it after Johnson left the NAACP, so from the 30s. And then finally, there's files in Walter White's papers with his second wife, Poppy Cannon. I have not looked at those to know what's in there. And I would just highlight, right now, unfortunately, the library is not open to the general public. Only Yale students and faculty are allowed in, and staff during the pandemic. But I hope that we'll be able to open the library up later this summer, and anyone is welcome to come and look and explore this material. The third I would like to highlight is we've actually digitized the correspondence between William Pickens and James Weldon Johnson. And all of those letters are available, freely available for people to look at. If you go to digital collections at Yale Library, and we'll also put it in as a follow-up when we post this online as to how to find that. So there are 2 folders of letters, and some of them are really, this is a lovely one about Dear Jim. This is after Johnson has settled in, oh, this is a different one. I was looking at another letter where he had settled in at Fisk University. But it's very interesting to read back and forth. And as you can tell, William Pickens' handwriting is, it can be challenging as well. I would also call out some of the other places if you're interested in learning more about William Pickens. The bulk of his papers are at the Schomburg Center at New York Public Library. There's lots of correspondence in there with folks in the NAACP, and then also later in his life as well, when he was working for the U.S. Treasury. There's also the Library of Congress's a collection of the NAACP papers at the Library of Congress. Mary White Ovington, who is one of the co-founders of the NAACP, her papers are at Wayne State. I would also encourage you to look and read contemporary Black newspapers and periodicals. Many of these have now been digitized. They are just huge amounts of information. And because he was writing and he was speaking all across the country, his name shows up all over the place. And the advantage of being digitized is much easier to sort through those today. And finally, there was a biography that was published in 1989 by Sheldon Avery, based upon his dissertation of 1970. That's a very good introduction. I think it's a bit dated. I think it would be really interesting to think about William Pickens' life after 30 more years of research and scholarship that has been done. And actually, there's more material that's easily available.